if you're at home taking notes, and we're going to read a verse here, but I'd like for you to, we're going to do, to start with, kind of a comparison of 1 Kings and Chronicles. Because as we're going to see at the very end of this, these are, yes, they're Old Testament books of history, but in some ways they remind me of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then the Gospel of John. And so if you'll just put Kings and write down 7 things, we're going to mention 7 things that are part of the writing of the history account of Kings. And then if you do Chronicles, we're also going to do 7 of those. And so for those who are online, if you want to just start doing that, if you're taking notes, that will kind of help. I want to read a passage in 1 Kings chapter 2 because just like on a train, there are parts that kind of connect and hook together. This will take us into our lesson next week in terms of the early part of Solomon's reign. But we just entitled our lesson tonight, David's Last Words. And it's just a very short paragraph, 1 Kings 2, verse 10. David slept with his fathers, was buried in the city of David, and at that time David reigned over Israel 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. And so Solomon sat upon the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. So when we look at the transition, if we go even back to the book of Judges, we have 300 years of these just kind of continual cycles that take place. And God's people will sin. There'll be some type of oppression that will come upon them. God will raise a deliverer, a judge. They'll live for a while, and then this cycle just continues for 300 years. And kind of the keynote verse in the book of Judges is, every man did what was right in his own eyes. And boy, doesn't that sound contemporary? There's just a lot of people. Well, let me say it this way. It's amazing how different your conversation with strangers takes place when they find out you're in ministry. You just hear all kinds of things and words and everything else, and they say, what do you do? Oh, I'm a minister. And it's kind of like, whoops. And, you know, I'm not there to judge. And I've probably heard worse than what they've said, but it's just amazing how different someone's going to treat Gary when they find out, oh, he's actually in ministry. And so, but I still hear a lot of people in one way or another saying, no one's going to tell me what to do. And we'll just hear that in different ways in society. And that's a part of the theme of the book of Judges. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Our 3 kings in what is typically called the United Kingdom, then Saul, David, and Solomon, are each going to reign about 40 years. Very different in attitudes, very different in lifestyles, but the United Kingdom, as we describe it in these terms, is going to take place over roughly 120 years, with each of these kings reigning for 40 years. One other thing, just in terms of chronology, because we always have different people in class. If this is the cross, I look back and Abraham is about 2000 BC. Some will put him as late as a part of the 1800s, but let's just leave him there. Abraham is approximately 2000 BC, and the easy way that I always remember that is that Abraham is as far before the cross as we are today after the cross. And then Moses is going to be approximately 500 years later into the 1500s. And so all of your events are going to take place through Genesis and getting us into Egypt and the time that they're there. And so Moses is going to be approximately 1500. But when we come to David, it's 1000. And so that's just kind of an easy way to remember that, because here are these 3 major characters in the Old Testament, and they're all approximately 500 years apart. Okay, give and take a little bit. However, when we come to David, because of archaeology, the dates that before that can vary quite a bit. We're within 1 year. And so David, just think 1000. So David is going to be 1,000 years before Jesus. And we're still going to touch on this in some different ways as we talk about Solomon. But the word that we used last week, and will come up again today, is that God intended for Israel to be a theocracy. And the word for God in Greek is theos, and so a theocracy is God rules. God is to be the king. And we'll see this in a passage here in a little bit, but remember the psalm that says, "Lift up your heads, O heavenly gates, that the King of glory may come in." And you think, okay, who is the King of glory? Oh, the Lord, strong and mighty. The Lord is the King of glory. So technically, God was to be the king, and then the earthly ruler, terms will be prince, leader, ruler. And yes, the term king is used, but technically, God is always to be seen as the king, and that's a part of the big contrast between the time of Judges, is that at least there is these men who arise that God wants to be the spiritual leader of their family. I wanted to do this initially, and I'll just explain this very briefly. To me, one of the benefits of a Bible class is to help us to be better Bible students when we're on our own. And when you read through the book of Kings and you read through the book of Chronicles, it's very obvious that they cover the same time period. However, there are some very clear distinctive differences. I still shake my head. This is kind of crazy. The summer, we got married in 1973, between our junior and senior year. That summer that we got married, I took 20 hours at OC, worked at Brahms Ice Cream at 5 o'clock a.m., and we were working with the Nakoma Park Church, and I was preaching twice a week and doing a Bible class. And we were the managers of the married student housing. So you can just kind of figure what kind of a semester that was. But my favorite Bible class for the time I was at OC was that semester, and it was Ezra and Nehemiah. Loved Brother Kelsey, loved Brother McCord. But Bill Jones taught this class in the summer on Ezra and Nehemiah, and as you go through this, you see all of these things that have happened all along, and we're at the end of the Old Testament, and if these godly men don't arise to bring the exiles back, it's like everything falls apart. Well, after we moved to Memphis, I was in an Old Testament class, and I'm guessing there were 50 or 60 of us, and Jack Lewis cryptically said, "There are paper topics downstairs on the bulletin board. I will only read 2. And so it was like the land run. A big part of 50 guys went racing down the stairs and stabbed each other to get their name on one of these topics, and I just thought, I'm just going to wait. I'm just going to wait. And after everyone had left and everything, I went through to see what was left. And the one that I chose because of Ezra and Nehemiah was, what is the purpose of Chronicles? And I'm so grateful that I did that because I wouldn't have done that before. But from that, they're very similar, they're parallel in time, but they're written both from a different perspective and a different point of view. So because David's last words are both in Kings and Chronicles, I thought let's just walk through very briefly. So here are going to be 7 items that are part of the writing of Kings, and then we'll do a parallel. Here are 7 items that are part of the things in Chronicles. If you have notes, it'll go 1-1 and then 2-1 if you see how it unfolds. So here's the same events that are described from a different perspective. When you read the book of Kings, it's more like a day-to-day account. The things are going to happen basically chronologically. They're going to kind of flow, and it's kind of like, I think of like a reporter, okay? Here's a news reporter, and he's reporting this happened, and this happened, and this took place. And like, for example, if someone's covering, you feel it, a hurricane or something like this, oh, this is when it came ashore, and this is what took place, and all. That's what I think of when I think of 1st and 2nd Kings. When you look at 2:1, Chronicles is going to view Israel's history with a much narrower focus in that, yes, after the kingdom divides, and it's going to happen in 931, after Solomon dies, and you're going to have your 10 kings in the north, your 2 kings in the south, then 1st and 2nd Kings is going to talk about both of these, where the book of Chronicles is primarily going to just describe the kings in the south. So 1st Kings tells the whole story on a day-to-day basis. Chronicles comes along and says, here are primarily the kings in the southern kingdom. 1-2. Kings tells us about the good and bad of Israel and Judah's kings. And just as things unfold, it's just kind of a straightforward narrative. He did this, he did that. And I'll just say it this way. the shortcomings of even the good kings are mentioned more in the book of Kings. When you come to Chronicles, Chronicles primarily highlights the lives of the good kings and will minimize some of the details of their faults and their shortcomings. We don't know. I wonder, did the writer of Chronicles already have the book of Kings? And this is the same thing when we read the gospel accounts. The one thing we do know about the gospel accounts is that when we come to the end of the book of Acts, and Paul is in house arrest in Rome for 2 years, then this is when he writes Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon, typically called the prison epistles. And in Colossians 4, he mentions very specifically, Luke and John Mark are with me. And just think about that for a second. In this house, under house arrest, we have the majority of the books of the New Testament in the minds of these three men. Paul's going to write the 13 letters. We're going to have the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, and Acts. And so we don't know about the others, but we do know for a period of time, Dr. Luke and John Mark are together with Paul. Okay, I'm being a little bit sarcastic. It's hard for me to imagine that they spent most of their time talking about the chariot races in the Colosseum. Okay? I love sports, and I'm not just totally criticizing that, but you just stop and think about it. If you have Luke and Paul and Mark, can you just imagine the conversations that took place? Here's something for you to look at. When you read from Romans down through the book of Titus, how many times in the writings of Paul do you specifically hear something historical from the life of Jesus? You can nearly count them on one hand. I wonder, with Dr. Luke and with Mark, how much did they talk about that? Were they already writing those? Were those things underway? And when you come to the very end of Paul's life in 2 Timothy, come to chapter 4, this to my mind is one of the saddest verses in the New Testament. Paul simply says, only Luke is with me. And you think, hundreds of people that he's met, he's worked with, only Luke is with me. He's far away, and Paul writes to Timothy, and he says, you go and get John Mark and bring him with me. And a part of this is the shipping lanes close down in the wintertime, and you can't travel. And so the last thing that we hear is that the last word to Timothy is, you go and get John Mark, bring him with you. He is profitable to me in ministry. In our devotional night, Paul and Barnabas split fellowship over John Mark. He's come good. Paul recognizes that. And Paul wants to have one more opportunity for these three guys to be together. And so we have this same type of thing going on in the first three, the synoptics, and in John. And I see that same type of thing happening in Chronicles, in that kings, good and bad, Israel and Judah, Chronicles, primarily Judah, and primarily the good things that are there. 1:3, the book of Kings is going to devote, and this isn't totally true, but still more so. I use the term equal print to both the good and the evil kings. And like I said, when I'm reading Kings, I think of a reporter, and he's just narrating this happened and this happened and this happened. When you come to Chronicles, here's the key. Without even reading the words, the bad kings get very little coverage, and the good kings generally get 3 or 4 chapters. And so you don't even have to read word for word what took place. If you come to a Hezekiah, if you come to a Jehoshaphat, if you come to, he was like his father David, then in the book of Chronicles, the good kings, and they're only from Judah, are going to get 3 or 4 chapters. The bad kings will be mentioned, but they'll be done very briefly. And this is why when you go from Solomon, and then notice how this unfolds, you'll do Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, Ahaziah, Athaliah, Ahaz, Jehoshaphat, Joshua, and Joshua's not in that. And then you're going to end up with the latter parts of the kings as they unfold. And these different kings are then weighed, and the more godly they are, and the more they are going to be a part of leading people to where they ought to be, then they get more print. Very different in the two. 1:4, the book of Kings is going to describe the military conflicts and the political struggles, especially between the two countries, between Israel and Judah. When you look at 2:4, then Chronicles is going to focus more primarily on the temple and the worship in the temple. So in one sense, Kings is more military, and then when you come to Chronicles, the focus is, this is what was going on in the worship, especially regarding to the temple and the worship that was there. 1:5, the book of Kings is going to have a lot of interaction between the prophets and the kings. And we've said this different ways in a couple of weeks. In a theocracy, the prophet is always over the king. And if you note that on the right side of your outline, I just put the prophet and put a line. David sins, and what happens? Nathan comes to him, tells him the parable about the family that had the one ewe lamb, and then eventually says, you're the one. And this interaction between the prophets and the kings is very pronounced. And just look at the count. I just looked at the word Elijah. 1 Kings 39 times, 1 Chronicles once. Elijah, 2 Kings 24 times, 2 Chronicles once. And so the Kings is going to devote time to this interaction, and especially because the ungodly kings are moving away, then God will send a prophet, whether it's Nathan or Elijah, to speak with them. So that's 1:5. When you look at 2:5, in the book of Chronicles, it's primarily the legacy of David. And you'll hear this at different times, and I'm sorry, I just hear a musical note in my head. You'll be reading along, and it will say, he was not like his father David. And mentally, I just go, dun, 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 dun. This is not going to be good. He was not like his father David. And you think, okay, we're going to go into a period of decline. Or if you hear, he was like his father David, and you think, okay, this is going to be a better period of time. And so the interaction in Kings with the prophets and the kings is featured in Chronicles. The line of David, both in terms of physical descent, but also spiritually, how much they were like their father. When you look at 1:6, and this is the ending, the book of Kings ends with the destruction of Jerusalem. And let me just do this quickly. I didn't write this down. There are 3 different times that Jerusalem is going to be attacked and overcome. The first is going to be 606. And in 606, that's when Daniel is carried off to Babylon captivity. And he goes up to Syria, across the Euphrates, and comes back down into Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar is going to come back again in 598, 597. The city is going to be captured again. And this time Ezekiel is going to be carried off and is going to be a captive among the people. And then there's the third one, 587, 586. Then he comes back and the city is completely destroyed, the temple's burnt, and this is how the book of Kings ends. The final destruction has taken place, the walls have been broken down, the temple's been destroyed, and a governor is going to be appointed. And you're just going to shake your head. Jeremiah the prophet lives through all this, and he's actually in Jerusalem. And he's been thrown into a well, he's been beaten, he's suffered all kinds of persecution, and he's lived through the destruction of Jerusalem. The Babylonians appoint a governor. There's a short rebellion. They kill their governor, and then against Jeremiah's will, then these people flee to Egypt. And they take Jeremiah with them. And this is just profoundly sad, and that's why when I'm talking with our kids when they were little, we talked about Jeremiah, and I just always do this. Jeremiah is the weeping prophet. Just so many things in his life were such a burden, and especially from 326 down through the destruction of Jerusalem, here's this weeping prophet calling people to come back. And especially you come to chapter 44, and he says, do not go to Egypt. And they finally have a governor after the city's been destroyed. They get together. They kill the governor. They're afraid of the Babylonians, and they decide, okay, we're going to go. And they carry Jeremiah off to Egypt with them. That's how the book of Kings ends. And here's what's significant. We've touched on this a couple of times. As you read through a biblical book, it's always important to read and say, what is the last historical event that takes place in this book? And the example we used last week is when you read the book of Ruth, yes, here's Ruth, the Moabitess, here's Boaz, but then what do those very last verses say? Okay, here's Boaz, here's Obed, here's Jesse, who is the father of David. So while the events take place 4 generations earlier, at least part of this book is not going to be written down until the time of David. So when you read Kings, it's kind of like, and let me just do this physically, you just kind of go, they've rebelled, they've been unfaithful, God finally has had enough, and bless his heart, the prophet Ezekiel in captivity sees a vision, and the glory of God leaves the temple before the temple's destroyed. And there's just kind of this hopeless feeling at the very end. We have a governor, we kill him, we rebel. What are we going to do? We're afraid of the Babylonians. Let's all run to Egypt. And that's how the book of Kings ends. Chronicles is very different. The people are in captivity, and God says this through the prophet Jeremiah. But let's do this under 2:6, and let me just read this. Chronicles ends after the 70 years of Babylonian captivity. So if you read very carefully in Jeremiah 25, 10 and 11, and Jeremiah 29 and 10, and think for a second, weeping prophet, he's in Jerusalem. So this is before the city's destroyed, and through the prophet Jeremiah, God says, you will be in captivity for 70 years. So just do this real quick. The city's going to fall the first time in 606. Daniel's a young man. He's part of those who are carried off. Handwriting on the wall, Daniel 5, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, the Babylonian Empire is going to fall. That takes place in 539. 3 years later, 536, God starts sending the people back. So someone help me. You subtract 536 from 606, and what do you get? 70 years. And so just exactly like God had said through the prophet Jeremiah, that the captivity was going to take place 70 years from the first ones who go in 606 down through 536, then this is what God prophesied through the prophet. I still think this is just an amazing verse. I just read this sometimes and shake the chills down. Here's Daniel. And let me just say this. We did this when we did the Old Testament survey. And I'm not being hypercritical, but I'm just stating something. We grew up in Bible class with flannel graph. Kelly, did y'all have any flannel graph in your Bible class? If you were a certain age, you had flannel graph when you were in Bible class. And I'm sorry, all of my pictures of flannel graph are of Daniel as a young man. Okay, I'm sorry, that's just my memory, and really clear about that. Well, let's do some addition for a second. If he goes into captivity in 606, and then the people start coming back in 536, how many years is that? And so how old is he when they take him into captivity? If he's 15 in 606, he's 85 years old. Do you see what I'm saying? When you take the 70 years of captivity and then you figure out how old Daniel was at the front, Charles, am I allowed to say he's an old man? You think carefully if someone's 95 before you start talking about someone was an old man. Let's say it this way, he's not a teenager. And that's when Daniel is in captivity. And so when you come to Daniel chapter 9, Daniel is reading from the book of Jeremiah. So stop and think about this. Here's the prophet Jeremiah. He stays in Jerusalem, weeping prophet. He's so sad he writes a lament about the fall of Jerusalem, and he writes all of these things down. Somehow, a copy of the book of Jeremiah goes up the Fertile Crescent, up through the Euphrates, comes down, and the prophet Daniel in captivity is reading the book of Jeremiah. And look at Daniel 9 and verse 2. In the first year of his reign, and this is going to become the Persians after the Babylonian Empire has fallen, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to the prophet Jeremiah, must pass before the end of the desolation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So think about this. This isn't just history that he has no knowledge about. Daniel lives through this. He knows when the captivity started. He's one of the captives. He's one of the ones that carries off. I'm sure he didn't call it 606. That's our designation. But Daniel starts figuring out, okay, this is when we were taken into captivity, and this is when God is going to start sending people back. And so when you read the book of Chronicles, then you have the 70 years of captivity, and we have the fall of the kingdom, okay? So take me with this. Handwriting on the wall in Daniel 5. Belshazzar is having the banquet. They're all drunk. I'm sorry. This just strikes me as funny. I had grandfathers on two sides of my family that were alcoholics, and my grandmother, who was an elder's wife, convinced me that I had the genetic propensity to become an alcoholic. So I was the only 8-year-old who knew the word genetic propensity. But she put the fear of the Lord into me. I could take a bath in champagne and never once do this because I have the genetic propensity to become an alcoholic. It's on both sides of my family. However, if you had a sore throat, it's amazing what whiskey and peppermint will do to help you to try to get better. So that's the only time we drank in my family, was that when we had a sore throat, then Grandma would sneak into the local store and get a bottle of whiskey. And if it aged a little bit, that was better, and she'd crush up some peppermint. I don't know if it has any medicinal value, but it just made you want to get better, okay? That's it. I just tell you, and you need to drink that. If you had a sore throat, then she would squeeze onion juice and take a swab and then swab your throat with raw onion juice. It may have had no medicinal value, but it made you want to get better. And then when she said, son, you need to take some castor oil with something else, and this is good for you. So you never told Grandma that you were sick. Okay. So anyway, all that's to say, I've never been drinking. But can you imagine drinking and having this banquet, and then all of a sudden up here, a hand appears? And you just see people kind of... Exactly. And fair enough. Here we are in the middle of this drunken brawl and this dinner, and all of a sudden this hand appears and starts writing on the wall, and there's no person there. And the writing's very clear, mene, tekel, parsin. And let's go find someone who can translate what's taking place. And the Daniel says, weighed in the balances and wanted, and the kingdom's going to fall that night. So here's the end of the Babylonians who carried them into captivity. And then when we come to the lion's den, Daniel is rising in the Persian Empire, and all of this is taking place, and this is in the end of the book of Chronicles, okay? Kings, the cities destroyed, were carried off into Egypt, and all these events take place, which gives us a whole different feel for the things that are there. So amazing to me in the book of Isaiah, and you'll see this at the end of 44 and 45. In one passage, God calls Cyrus my shepherd. In another passage, God calls Cyrus, the king of Persia, my anointed one, and he's going to send the people back, and all of those things are going to take place. 1:7, when you read Kings, to me it's more like Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Here's the events, here's what takes place. John is much more conceptual. John is more thematic. John's going to talk about light and darkness and bread and all these other things. And so when you read through the book of Kings, you're going to read through the narrative, this happened, and this happened. And then Chronicles is going to come along and be much more thematic. I still shake my head when I think about this. It just makes my head hurt. We moved to Memphis to go to school for 3 years, and Sheila was hired to teach in an academy that had special needs children. The program was called Delman Del Cotto, and so she had 10 students each day, and they ranged from age 8 to 18. So think about this. If you're a teacher, you have 10 students who are from 8 to 18, and every one of them has a different lesson plan for the day. Half of the day, none of these kids had ever crawled. And one of their beliefs was that the inability to crawl had produced certain physical handicaps, and there would be 4 people on a mat, and they would do programming things for part of the day. Sheila would have them for the other half and try to work with them at their different levels. But can you imagine being a beginning teacher and having 10 different lesson plans every day, and your kids are from 8 to 18? If you know my wife, she's no pushover, and she very quickly then said, we have one rule in our class. Oh, so Kelly, so stop me at this. We're special need kids from 8 to 18, and we're going to have one rule. When you do good things happen. Guess what? When you do bad things, bad things happen. So I'm sorry, even if you're a special needs student at 8, you can understand Miss Hartman's going to be very clear. She's going to be very consistent. When you do good things in my class, good things happen. When you do bad things happen. Guess what I think of when I read the book of Chronicles? Because we're going to focus primarily on the south, we're going to focus on the temple, we're going to focus on Judah. All the good kings get 3 to 4 chapters, the bad kings get 1. And that to me is kind of the reading of the book of Chronicles in contrast to the day-to-day events that take place in 1st and 2nd Kings. Okay, speeding right along. I want us to cover 4 things, and I'll leave part of these for you to look at. Here's some things about David's last words, and anticipate the word heart. And I touch here, and I know heart is more to do with our spiritual and our being and stuff, but still, in terms of just thinking about heart is going to be very important, and it's going to come up in these. And so we're in 1 Chronicles 28 and 2. Hear me, my brothers and my people. I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant and for the footstool of our God. And I made preparations for the building, but God said to me, you may not build a house for my name, for you are a man of war and have shed blood. Yet the Lord God chose me of all my father's house to be king over Israel forever. It is Solomon your son who shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father. And so David just says, God's lived in a tent for 500 years. Why am I living in a palace and the Ark of the Covenant's in a tent? And I did a reference here, and I didn't get the, let's do it. Let's stay with First Chronicles 28 and 7. I will establish his kingdom forever if, and see, notice that, if he continues strong in my commandments and my rules as he is today and observes all those things. And we're going to find out by the end of Solomon's life, he's not going to do that. This verse, and if you mark in your Bible, this is very important. This is back in 2 Samuel chapter 7, and the same type thing. Initially, and this is again the history of what takes place, David's thinking about this, Nathan says it's in your heart, go and do it. And then the Lord comes to him and says, and let me say it in an abbreviation, you are not going to build me a house, I'm going to make of you a house. Hear the pun? David is thinking about building a physical house for the Lord. Nope, you're not going to do that, you're a man of blood. Your son Solomon's going to do that, but I'm going to make of you a house, and one of your descendants will sit on the throne forever. Sorry? And he's talking about a spiritual house. And by the time we come to the end of the Old Testament and we don't have a king in Israel, this is a part of why for 600 years they've been saying, where's this king? Where's this king? And what's the shadow and the reality? Jesus. Where is he who was born king of the Jews? And as we said earlier, what's the first and last person we meet in our New Testament? King David. the beginning of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Oh, the bright and morning star, the root of David in Revelation. And King David is the opening and the closing of our New Testament. And God is going to build him a house, and the kingdom will last forever. And how amazing, 1,000 years later, the promise that God makes to David, and as you mentioned, the spiritual kingdom is then going to be fulfilled in Jesus. I have just cried sometimes. Jesus of Nazareth, the inscription said, who is he? King of the Jews. And so from the wise men to the cross, there's a theme of the king and the things of David that go through. David's last words to Solomon, this to me is an anchor verse in my life. There are certain verses that I come back to, either have them written down or what. And this one's 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 9. And again, we're in part of these last words. David's talking to Solomon. The word know is so important, and know is a relational word. Adam knew Eve, and it wasn't like, oh, she's got brown hair and brown eyes and she's 5. Adam knew Eve is a relational word, and David spiritually is going to say to Solomon, know the Lord, serve him with a whole heart and with a willing mind. And here's the verse. The Lord searches all hearts, understands every plan and thought. If you seek him, he will be found by you, but if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. And I want you to just stop and think about that. The Lord searches all hearts. Sometimes as long as we keep our mouth shut, people don't know what we're thinking or what's going on in our mind. And guess what? Before a word comes to my mouth, lo, O Lord, thou knowest it altogether. Psalm 139. And one of the really significant things in here is for us just to stop and think, God knows our hearts. And this is why you just want to cry by the time we get finished. He's not a teenager. He's an old man, and his wives turn his heart away from God. Be careful about those things. If you look at the next page, David is going to invite the people to give, and he says the palace is not for man, the palace is for God. I'll just let you read the tons of gold and silver and things that are mentioned, and these are all in 1 Chronicles 29. David just says, I have provided for the house of my God as far as I was able. And I always think this, David is not asking the people to do something he's not going to take the initiative to do as well. And this to me is always an important bottom line. So many of the structures, the materials that were going to be needed to build the temple have been gathered by David before Solomon even becomes king. And even though God says you will not build the house, God doesn't say you can't bring all the things together for the house to be built. And you read this paragraph, and it's amazing, all the things that David brought together. And then in 1 Chronicles 29 and 9, the people rejoiced because they had given willingly with a whole heart. They had offered freely to the Lord, and David rejoiced. So here's David's final prayer as given in 1 Kings chapter 2. David's time to die drew near, and he commanded Solomon, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. And look at these 4 things. Be strong, show yourself a man. 2, chapter 2, verse 3, keep the charge of the Lord your God. 3, walk in his ways and keep his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimony, as is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper. And again, you'll see with all of their heart and all of their soul. And if you notice at the bottom, look at the word heart. 52 times in Samuel, 39 times in the Kings, 48 times in Chronicles. So here's our review on the back page. Here's our word prince. Remember we said God didn't look at David primarily as the king. He is a prince. David is chosen as prince because of his heart. 1 Samuel 13:14, God says through Samuel to Saul, "Your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commended him to be prince over the people." Then later God says to Samuel, 1 Samuel 16:7, "The Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance. The Lord looks on the heart." As late as Acts 13:22, "I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my heart who will do my will." And I think about this sometimes. We have a spiritual heart because God has a heart. We have a spiritual mind because God has a mind expressed so much in creation and then in Revelation. And yes, we have the physical body, but this capacity of the heart to choose, to serve, to live, to walk is ours because it's something that we share in common with God. Spiritual heart matters are important. I had it in my heart to build a house, 1 Chronicles 28:2. 28:9, "Serve him with a whole heart." And then the people gave because with a whole heart, they offered it freely. 1 Kings 2:9, and I made this in larger print, "If, Solomon, just if you'll do these things, then your kingdom will continue, if you walk before me in faithfulness with all of their heart and all of their soul." Then looking back at David, 1 Kings 3:6, "You've shown steadfast love to David. He walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart toward you." So we're going to close with two verses. And you can do this in different accounts. But Jesus is simply asked, what is the first and greatest commandment? And the very, very first one is simply this: love the Lord your God with all your heart. And again, in talking with our children as they were growing up, we had this discussion. If God doesn't get your heart, he doesn't get the rest of you. The same way, if I'm talking with a couple who are having trouble, we just read 1 Corinthians 13 and we say, love is what? Patient, and love is kind. If we don't do the first two, we don't need to worry about the rest of 1 Corinthians 13. For the next week or two, can we just work on love is patient and love is kind to try to keep this marriage together? Spiritually, in our walk with God, teacher, what is the first and the greatest commandment? The very first thing, the first rattle out of the box is love the Lord your God with all your heart. Other things will follow, but again, notice the significance of that. And we have a spiritual heart because God does as well. Proverbs 4 and verse 3. I was a son with my father, tender he taught me. Let your heart hold fast my words and keep my commandments and live. And this is hard to say, but Mel especially will talk about this. I'll be gone for a couple of weeks later. Solomon wrote a lot better than he lived. And our closing verse tonight is, keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life, ESV says. And that's something to me that just is haunting. And I'll just say this quickly. I didn't have, working with young people, just thousands of them through the years, it always bothered me at a youth rally when someone says, you know, the biggest temptations you're ever going to have are as a teenager. And you're shaking your head no, and I'm thinking, no. Compared to, and you just start filling in the blank. And then bless their heart, these people that have teenagers and then are taking care of aged parents, and the list goes on, the different temptations that we're going to have. It's a struggle with our heart all the way through. And this is so important. Keep your heart with all vigilance. Look at the other translations. Watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And guard your heart above all else. It's the source of life. And Lord willing, one of the things we're going to look at is that three things are going to cost Solomon his heart and his walk with God. And they're going to be power and sex and money. And there's more to it than just those three, but those three things will come up again and again. And I think it's appropriate for us to close by just being reminded, for each one of us, keep your heart with all diligence, for from your heart flows the issues of life.